For more than 2 decades, one man held the keys to American entertainment. Every Sunday night, families across the United States gathered around their television sets, waiting for the same familiar introduction. The Ed Sullivan Show was not just another program, it was the biggest stage in the country. Over 50 million people tuned in each week, and whoever appeared on that stage instantly became a household name. In an era before social media and instant fame, Ed Sullivan had the power to change lives overnight. If Sullivan invited a performer to his show, it meant they had truly arrived. Unknown singers became national sensations. New comedians turned into superstars. Bands that no one had ever heard of suddenly found themselves at the top of the charts. Sullivan did not just follow trends, he created them. His show shaped American pop culture in a way no other program ever had. People in the entertainment industry understood how powerful he was. A former producer once said that being booked on the Ed Sullivan Show was like being given a golden ticket. By the next morning, everyone in America would know your name. That was the level of influence he carried. But with that power came a heavy responsibility. Behind the bright lights and applause, Sullivan took his role very seriously. He believed that the performers he introduced to the public represented more than just talent. They represented values, attitudes, and messages that would reach millions of homes. He was not just choosing entertainers, he was choosing the faces of American culture. What most viewers never knew was that Sullivan paid close attention to everything that happened behind the scenes. A longtime stage manager later revealed that Ed kept private notes about performers. He observed how they treated staff, how they behaved backstage, and what kind of people they really were when the cameras were not rolling. Sometimes, after a guest finished their performance, Sullivan would quietly turn to his team and say a simple sentence, "That's the last time they're on my stage." For many years, people assumed those decisions were based on attitude or ego. But the truth was much deeper and much more serious. What truly disturbed Ed Sullivan was not arrogance or difficult behavior. It was something far uglier. It was racism. As the years went by, Sullivan began to notice things that made him uncomfortable. He saw famous entertainers demanding segregated dressing rooms. He heard stories about performers who refused to share the stage with Black artists. He watched as some of America's most beloved stars smiled for the cameras while hiding hateful beliefs behind closed doors. And slowly, the man who had helped create so many legends began to feel regret. Every time he introduced one of these performers, he knew that he was giving them legitimacy in front of millions of people. His stage had helped build their careers, and that realization weighed heavily on him. Ed Sullivan had always believed that his show brought people together. But over time, he started to understand that some of the stars he celebrated did not believe in the same unity and equality that he did. This is the story of those performers. The stars America loved, the icons the public trusted, and the shocking truths that Ed Sullivan discovered about them behind the curtain. To the millions of viewers watching from home, the Ed Sullivan Show looked like a perfect world of music, laughter, and entertainment. Every Sunday night, performers stepped onto the stage, smiled for the cameras, and gave America moments that felt magical. But what happened behind the curtain was very different from what the audience saw on their television screens. Ed Sullivan was not just a host who read cue cards and introduced guests. He was a careful observer of people. Those who worked closely with him later revealed that he paid attention to every small detail. He noticed how performers treated stagehands, how they behaved in rehearsals, and what kind of attitudes they carried when they thought no one was watching. One longtime stage manager explained that Sullivan kept private notes about many of the stars who appeared on his show. These notes were not about how well they sang or acted. They were about their character. If a performer acted rude, disrespectful, or arrogant, Sullivan remembered it. And if he saw something truly disturbing, he made sure that person would never be invited back. There were times when a famous singer or comedian would finish a performance to thunderous applause, only for Sullivan to quietly turn to his staff and say, "That's the last time they're on my stage." The public would never know why. But Ed knew. At first, most people assumed his decisions were based on simple personality conflicts. But over the years, those close to him began to understand the real reason behind many of his private bans. What truly upset Ed Sullivan was not bad attitudes or big egos. It was racism. As the civil rights movement began to grow in America, Sullivan saw more and more disturbing behavior from some of the biggest names in entertainment. He watched performers demand segregated dressing rooms. He heard about singers who refused to appear on the same stage as Black artists. He learned that certain stars would only agree to come on his show if they were surrounded exclusively by white musicians and crew members. These were things the audience at home never saw. On camera, everyone smiled and acted friendly. But backstage, the truth was often ugly. Some entertainers built their entire careers on Black music, copying the sound, style, and creativity of Black artists. Yet those same performers refused to give credit to the people who inspired them. Others made millions from songs written by Black musicians while openly supporting segregation and discrimination. Ed Sullivan began to realize that his stage was sometimes being used to promote people whose beliefs went completely against his own values. This was not an easy truth for him to accept. For years, he had believed that entertainment brought people together. His show featured audiences of all backgrounds, and he took pride in slowly making his program more diverse and inclusive. But now, he was faced with a painful contradiction. Some of the very stars he had helped make famous were secretly fighting against that progress. His wife Sylvia later said that these discoveries bothered Ed deeply. He hated hypocrisy, and nothing felt more hypocritical to him than entertainers who smiled in front of America while treating people unfairly behind the scenes. The more he learned, the heavier the burden became. He started to question many of the bookings he had made in the past. He wondered how many careers he had helped build without truly knowing the kind of people he was putting in front of millions. And as the years passed, he quietly created a mental list of performers he wished he had never given a platform to. This list included some of the most beloved and respected names in show business, stars who looked perfect in the public eye, but whose private actions told a very different story. And the first name on that list was a man who built his entire career by taking from others while pretending to be America's most wholesome entertainer. As the years passed, Ed Sullivan began to understand something painful about the entertainment world he helped create. Fame did not always mean integrity. Popularity did not always mean decency. And some of the brightest stars on his stage were hiding very dark attitudes behind their public smiles. At first, Sullivan had believed that talent was all that mattered. If someone could sing, perform, or make people happy, he felt they deserved a chance. But slowly, he realized that talent alone was not enough. Character mattered too. The more he learned about what was happening backstage, the more uncomfortable he became. He started noticing patterns. Many performers loved to talk about unity and entertainment bringing people together. But behind the scenes, some of those same people were demanding segregation and exclusion. There were singers who proudly performed music created by Black artists, yet refused to share a dressing room with them. There were entertainers who became rich and famous by copying Black musical styles, but treated Black performers as if they were beneath them. And there were beloved public figures who smiled on television while privately holding deeply racist beliefs. To Sullivan, this hypocrisy was hard to ignore. His show had always been about bringing America together. Over time, he had worked hard to make his program more inclusive, booking more Black performers and giving them a national platform. He believed that music and entertainment should break down barriers, not build them higher. But he was beginning to realize that not everyone he invited onto his stage believed in those same values. Each time he discovered another ugly truth about a famous guest, it hurt him personally. These were people he had trusted, people he had introduced to millions of families as role models and icons. And now he was learning that some of them did not deserve that trust. What made it even more difficult was that the audience had no idea. Viewers at home only saw the polished image. They did not see the backstage demands, the racist comments, or the unfair treatment of Black artists and crew members. Ed Sullivan saw it all. And because he saw it, he had to live with the knowledge that his stage had helped give power and legitimacy to people who did not truly deserve it. That realization slowly turned into regret. Over time, he began to look back at certain bookings with a sense of disappointment. He wondered how many times he had been fooled by a charming smile or a carefully crafted public image. He thought about the performers he had helped make famous and asked himself whether he would still make the same choices if he had known the truth earlier. This is where the real story begins. Behind the bright lights of the Ed Sullivan Show was a private list in Sullivan's mind. A list of stars he secretly wished he had never promoted. A list of entertainers whose racism and hypocrisy he could not forget. Some of the names on that list shocked even the people closest to him. They were singers, actors, and icons that America loved and trusted. People who built careers on images of kindness, patriotism, and respectability. But behind closed doors, they were something very different. And the first example of that painful truth was a clean-cut young singer who became rich and famous by taking from Black artists while openly standing against integration. When Pat Boone first appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, he looked like the perfect American entertainer. Clean-cut, polite, well-dressed, and always smiling, he seemed like the ideal role model for young people. In the 1950s, when rock and roll was considered wild and dangerous by many parents, Boone was presented as the safe alternative. Ed Sullivan himself often introduced him that way. Compared to the rebellious image of Elvis Presley, Pat Boone appeared calm, respectable, and wholesome. With his white shoes and gentle voice, he quickly became one of the most popular singers in America. But behind that polished image was a very different reality. Pat Boone's entire career was built on covering songs originally created by Black musicians. Instead of promoting the original artists, record companies used Boone to record softer, cleaner versions of their music so that white radio stations would play them. Songs like Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino, Tutti Frutti, and Long Tall Sally by Little Richard became huge hits when Boone sang them, but the Black artists who actually created those songs rarely received the same attention or success. While Boone became rich and famous, the original performers were often pushed aside. Little Richard later spoke openly about how painful it was to watch his own music become more popular when sung by a white artist. He said that Boone turned powerful, soulful songs into something safe and watered down for white audiences. What should have been Richard's success was handed over to someone else. But the problem was not only musical theft, it went deeper than that. As the civil rights movement began to grow in America, Pat Boone openly supported segregationist ideas. He presented himself as a Christian, moral figure, but his beliefs about race told a very different story. One incident on The Ed Sullivan Show made everything painfully clear. In 1958, when Sullivan considered booking a Black performer on the same episode as Boone, Boone's management reportedly made it clear that they did not want him appearing on an integrated show. For Sullivan, this was deeply disturbing. Here was a man who had built his entire career using Black music, yet he did not want to share a stage with Black artists. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Sullivan's wife later said that Ed would stand backstage watching Boone perform and shake his head in disappointment. The clean, friendly image on television was not the same as the person behind the scenes. What hurt Sullivan the most was that Boone never apologized. He never gave proper credit to the Black musicians who made his success possible. He continued to profit from their talent while refusing to support their rights. To Ed Sullivan, this was one of his earliest and biggest regrets. He had helped introduce Pat Boone to millions of Americans. He had helped build his image as a wholesome, respectable star. And only later did he realize what was hiding behind that smile. It was one of the first times Sullivan understood that fame and goodness were not always the same thing. But Pat Boone was only the beginning. Another beloved American icon would soon prove to Sullivan that racism could hide even behind the most patriotic image imaginable. For many years, Kate Smith was considered one of the most beloved voices in America. To millions of listeners, she was the woman who sang God Bless America with such power and emotion that people felt proud just hearing her voice. On The Ed Sullivan Show, she was often treated like a national treasure, a symbol of patriotism and traditional American values. Sullivan himself respected her deeply. Whenever she appeared on his stage, he introduced her as the voice of the nation. To the public, she represented everything good and wholesome about the country. But behind that inspiring image was a much darker history. Decades after her rise to fame, recordings from the early years of her career revealed that Kate Smith had performed songs filled with racist lyrics. In the 1930s, she had recorded and sung material that openly mocked and degraded Black people. Some of those songs romanticized slavery and treated racial oppression like a joke. Even more troubling was the fact that she had appeared in blackface performances on radio shows, something that was common in early entertainment but deeply offensive and harmful. What shocked Ed Sullivan the most was not only her past, but her behavior many years later. As America slowly began to change during the 1950s and 1960s, Smith refused to change with it. Civil rights groups documented incidents where she canceled performances rather than sing for integrated audiences. She made it clear that she did not want to perform in front of mixed crowds. When she appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, her team reportedly made strict demands. No Black musicians were allowed to perform alongside her. No Black backup singers could be used. Even backstage, she did not want Black crew members visible during her performances. For Sullivan, who was trying to make his show more inclusive, these demands were extremely uncomfortable. There was one particular incident that stayed with him. During a 1960 appearance, stage managers remembered Smith objecting to Black stagehands being too close to her performance area. She insisted on having only white staff around her. Sullivan hated giving in to these conditions, but sometimes he felt trapped. Kate Smith was a huge star, and refusing her could cause major problems. Publicly, he remained professional. Privately, he was deeply disappointed. To him, the contradiction was unbearable. Here was a woman who sang about loving America, about unity and pride, yet she did not want to share a stage with all Americans. She performed God Bless America while quietly excluding millions of Americans from that blessing. Sullivan's wife later said that this hypocrisy bothered Ed more than almost anything else. He believed that patriotism should include everyone, not just a selected group. Years later, when her old racist recordings resurfaced and became public knowledge, many people were shocked. But Sullivan had already seen enough behind the scenes to know the truth long before the rest of the country did. To him, Kate Smith became one of the clearest examples of how a beautiful public image could hide ugly beliefs underneath. And sadly, she was far from the only one. Another entertainer with a friendly, harmless image would soon show Sullivan that racism did not always shout loudly. Sometimes, it hid quietly behind a polite smile. Not all racism in the entertainment world was loud and obvious. Sometimes, it came dressed in politeness, charm, and friendly smiles. Two of the clearest examples of this kind of quiet discrimination were Perry Como and Lawrence Welk, both hugely popular figures who appeared many times on The Ed Sullivan Show. To the public, Perry Como was known as Mr. Nice Guy. He had a smooth, gentle voice and a calm, relaxed personality. His television show ran for many years, and he was seen as one of the most harmless and pleasant entertainers in America. Ed Sullivan often called him the perfect television gentleman. But behind that friendly image was a very different reality. During the years that Como hosted his own television program, almost no Black performers ever appeared on his stage. Not as guest stars, not as musicians, not even as backup singers. Internal network records later showed that Como had full control over who appeared on his show, and he consistently chose to keep it completely white. There were even reports that when producers suggested inviting Black performers, Como quietly rejected the idea, saying his audience expected a certain kind of show. In other words, he believed that integrated performances would make white viewers uncomfortable. For Ed Sullivan, this was deeply troubling. Sullivan was slowly working to make his own program more diverse, and he could not understand why someone with so much influence would refuse to do the same. But Perry Como was not alone. Another frequent Sullivan guest, Lawrence Welk, took this kind of exclusion even further. Welk hosted one of the most popular music programs on American television for more than 30 years. His orchestra and variety show were seen as family-friendly, cheerful, and wholesome. Millions of people loved his simple, traditional style. Yet for more than 3 decades, Lawrence Welk never hired a single Black musician for his orchestra. Not one, even during the height of the civil rights movement, when the rest of the country was slowly moving toward integration, Welk kept his band completely white. Former musicians later confirmed that this was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy. Black performers who auditioned for his show were quietly turned away. Everyone in the industry knew that traditional for Welk meant white only. On The Ed Sullivan Show, this became painfully obvious. As Sullivan began featuring more and more Black artists, Welk's all-white orchestra stood out sharply in contrast. It represented an old-fashioned world that refused to change. One backstage story captured the tension perfectly. During the 1960s, Welk reportedly commented that Sullivan's orchestra looked different from what he was used to, a clear reference to its increasing diversity. For Sullivan, that attitude felt outdated and wrong. What made it even more frustrating was that Welk did not even seem to understand why his policy was a problem. He saw segregation as simply part of his brand and tradition. To Ed Sullivan, this kind of quiet, polite racism was just as harmful as open hatred. It sent a message to millions of viewers that Black performers did not belong on certain stages. And as the years went by, Sullivan began booking both Como and Welk less and less. He could no longer ignore the contradiction between their friendly public images and the exclusion they practiced behind the scenes. But even these cases of quiet segregation were not the most painful examples Sullivan would encounter. Soon, he would be forced to confront an even older, uglier chapter of entertainment history. By the time Sophie Tucker appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in the 1950s and early 1960s, she was already considered a living legend. She had been a star since the early days of vaudeville, long before television even existed. Sullivan treated her with deep respect, often introducing her as one of the pioneers of American entertainment. To the audience, she was a charming, bold, and confident performer from another era. Many viewers saw her as a symbol of classic show business history. But that history carried a very dark side. Long before Sophie Tucker became famous, she had built much of her early career performing in blackface, a racist tradition that was common in the early 1900s. In those days, white performers would paint their faces black and imitate black singers and comedians in ways that mocked and degraded them. Tucker herself wrote about this openly in her autobiography. At the time, she did not see anything wrong with it. To her, it was simply part of the entertainment business. But by the 1950s and 60s, attitudes were beginning to change, and Sullivan was becoming more aware of how harmful those traditions had been. What troubled Sullivan was not only Tucker's past, but her attitude in the present. Even decades after she stopped performing in blackface, she never expressed regret about it. She spoke about those days as if they were just harmless memories, refusing to acknowledge the pain and disrespect behind them. There were also stories from backstage that shocked Sullivan's team. In 1959, during one of her appearances, Tucker allegedly made a dismissive comment about a young black singer waiting to perform. She reportedly said that in her day, that performer would never have been allowed backstage. Hearing that kind of attitude in the late 1950s, at a time when Sullivan was working hard to integrate his show, was deeply upsetting. Ed Sullivan had grown up admiring many stars from the vaudeville era. But now he was beginning to realize that much of that era had been built on open racism and exclusion. The more he learned, the more uncomfortable his nostalgia became. Sophie Tucker represented that uncomfortable truth. She was celebrated as a trailblazer, yet part of her success had come from traditions that disrespected black performers and stole from their culture. And even as the world changed around her, she never truly changed with it. Her final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show came in 1963. By then, Sullivan had quietly decided that he no longer wanted to give a platform to entertainers whose attitudes were stuck in the past. He remained polite and professional as he always did, but privately, his admiration for her had faded. To Sullivan, Tucker became a symbol of how deeply racism had been woven into the history of American entertainment. It was a reminder that prejudice was not just a modern problem. It had been part of show business for generations. But as disturbing as these older stories were, Sullivan soon discovered that even the new, rebellious world of rock and roll had its own forms of hypocrisy. And one of the biggest shocks came from a band that claimed to love black music more than anyone else. When the Rolling Stones first appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, they were presented as the new face of rebellious, modern music. Young, energetic, and heavily inspired by American blues, the band quickly became icons of the rock and roll generation. To the public, they seemed like artists who deeply respected black culture and black musicians. Mick Jagger often spoke in interviews about his admiration for blues legends like Muddy Waters. Keith Richards called black guitarists his biggest teachers and inspirations. The band even took their name from a Muddy Waters song. On the surface, it looked like a perfect example of appreciation and respect. But behind the scenes, Ed Sullivan and his team began to notice a very different story. According to people who worked on the show, the band's management made specific backstage requests that shocked the crew. During their 1965 appearance, there were reports that the Rolling Stones asked for only white staff members to handle their dressing rooms and personal needs. For a program that was becoming more and more integrated, this request created immediate tension. Sullivan had worked hard to make his show a place where black and white performers could appear together. Hearing that a band built on black music wanted segregated treatment felt deeply hypocritical. What made the situation even more disturbing was the contrast between their public image and their private behavior. In interviews, the Stones talked proudly about black music and black artists, but when it came to real-life interactions, they often kept their distance. Backstage, some crew members noticed that the band seemed uncomfortable around black staff and performers. There were also moments outside the Sullivan Show that raised concerns. In the mid-1960s, Mick Jagger made comments in interviews that used crude stereotypes about black neighborhoods and communities. Instead of apologizing, he brushed the criticism aside, treating it like harmless humor. Keith Richards also made statements that sounded like compliments but carried an uncomfortable tone. He often described black musicians as having natural rhythm, reducing years of skill and artistry to simple biology rather than true talent. To Sullivan, this kind of attitude was hard to accept. The Rolling Stones had built their entire sound on black American music. They became rich and famous by performing songs and styles created by black artists who were still struggling to get recognition. Yet, when it came time to stand up for those same people, the band often stayed silent. During their tours in the American South, the Stones performed at segregated venues without protest. They did not challenge the system. They simply accepted it. For a band that claimed to respect black culture so deeply, their lack of action spoke louder than their words. Sullivan found himself in a difficult position. He could not deny their popularity or talent. Every time they appeared on his show, ratings went through the roof. But privately, he began to question what kind of message he was helping to send. How could he celebrate artists who praised Black music on camera but avoided Black people behind the curtain? This realization added another name to his growing list of regrets. And yet, even the Rolling Stones were not the most painful disappointment for Sullivan. The next performer on his list was someone America loved even more, a woman who seemed like a symbol of innocence and kindness. Some of the names on Ed Sullivan's private regret list were shocking because they did not fit the image the public had of them at all. Two of the most painful examples for Sullivan were Judy Garland and Gene Autry, entertainers who were loved and trusted by millions, yet carried deeply troubling attitudes behind the scenes. To most Americans, Judy Garland was the ultimate symbol of innocence and talent. She was Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, the fragile star who survived years of pressure and personal struggles. Whenever she appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, she was treated with kindness and respect, almost like a national treasure. But those who worked closely with Garland often saw a very different side of her. Backstage, many musicians and crew members described moments when Garland used offensive racial language casually, especially when she was stressed or frustrated. Several people who toured with her in the 1960s later spoke about how uncomfortable it was to hear her make slurs and insensitive comments as if they were normal. One musician recalled that during rehearsals, she would sometimes snap at Black performers using disrespectful words, showing little awareness of how hurtful they were. To the public, Garland was a victim of Hollywood's cruelty. But behind the curtain, she could be cruel herself. What made this even more painful was her relationship with Black performers like Lena Horne. Garland publicly praised Horne's talent, yet she never used her own power to help her get equal treatment in the industry. She accepted a system that kept Black artists in the background while she remained the star. For Ed Sullivan, who had always admired Garland, learning these things was heartbreaking. He had believed in her image of compassion and vulnerability. Discovering that she could behave so differently in private was a hard truth to accept. But as disappointing as Garland was, another figure on Sullivan's list represented an even deeper kind of hypocrisy. Gene Autry, known as the singing cowboy, was one of the most beloved entertainers in America. Children grew up watching his movies and listening to his songs about honesty, fairness, and kindness. On The Ed Sullivan Show, he was presented as a true American hero,